With Muslims, the subject of hadith has been in continuous study since the first century of Islam, whilst the academic, or what some would call the Western Orientalist study of hadith, only began in the middle of the 19th century. But in the last 40 years or so, academic scholarship has begun to take stock of not just the authenticity of what is reported in hadith, but also of their origins and mode of transmission. Those two aspects of hadith, origins and transmission, carries us into the topic of today's conversation. Our guest in this installment of Real Talk with Turan Pool is senior lecturer in Islamic Studies at the University of Edinburgh, but has also worked as lecturer and researcher at the Universities of Hamburg and Basel, and the Social Science Research Center Berlin, Freie Universität Berlin, and the University of Kiel, and served as acting professor for early and classical Islam at the University of Hamburg. His research interests include early Islamic history and historiography, the life of the Prophet Muhammad, Quran and Quranic exegesis, hadith, Islamic law, the transmission of Arabic manuscripts, Islam in its late antique environment, and the impact of modernity on Muslim thought. Please welcome Dr. Andreas Görke, and thank you, Professor, for meeting with me today for what I believe is going to be a very interesting conversation.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
All right, and let's get into it. Though the crux of this conversation is centered around an academic approach to dating hadith, I believe it is necessary to first make a distinction between scholarly and non-scholarly approaches to the subject in general. The next set of questions are based on your article, Hadith Between Traditional Muslim Scholarship and Academic Approaches. So first, I would like to know, what was your thought process which compelled you to address non-scholarly approaches to hadith in the article first? That was something I found very interesting and a topic I have not seen touched on by many specialists. So what made you decide to tackle non-scholarly approaches first in the article?
Well, it's something that I frequently come across when listening to the news, reading articles, looking in debates on the internet, that there's so much just said, quoted from hadith without any context, without any discussion about what is going on, that this is something that needs to be addressed. And that when I systematically try to research on the question of what are the differences between what traditional Muslim scholarship did and what are now academics doing in universities studying the hadith, I came across a number of articles that weren't really scholarly. And I thought that this is something that needs to be addressed. It's something that likewise is out there and shouldn't be neglected. And also to make clear that very much of what we might, how we might come across hadith in the first instance is not necessarily scholarly at all.
Mm. So what you're saying is just by taking the contents of a hadith, it's not enough to say this is how I'm supposed to apply it, but there's more that goes into it than just the contents of the hadith alone.
Yes, I mean, the hadith usually are not there, don't stand alone. They're on a given topic, there are usually quite a number of hadith, some with a very similar gist, but you will also find contradictory hadith and say exactly the opposite. And the question of how to deal with these different versions of hadith, but also contradicting hadith, is something that by just quoting an individual hadith, you don't do anyone justice. It's something you have to explain why that hadith would be relevant in that particular instance.
And that's one thing that I noticed from your article, or that you highlighted, non-scholarly approaches to hadith before our modern time was very different than how we approach it today. But that non-scholarly, what you call internal, which is for Muslims, depended on experts in order to elucidate the hadith and bring meaning or bring out what is supposed to be extracted from it. Whereas today, due to mass printing, and I believe the Ottomans might have been onto something by delaying the printing press. You see, the availability of hadith being the availability of hadith being like it has never been before. You also provide a very interesting spectrum of the non-scholarly approach. Can you describe this spectrum and what you found their aim and objectives were and why they use hadith literature?
So from the non-scholarly approaches, you find that as from in earlier times where there was much less literacy, usually people might know individual hadith, but they would usually not necessarily know how to apply them. And they would rely on the expertise of people who would explain them in their context. But not everyone would have had hadith collections at home. So these were confined more to the scholarly realm. So you would find them amongst scholars, but not necessarily available to everyone, and not everyone was literate. The availability was much less than it is now. It was conceived as something that is important. So to know hadith, even only individual ones, or to listen to hadith was something of a pious act. So if you could quote a number of hadith, that was something that was really something that would be honored by others. So it's more of the hadith would be seen as something that's important and worth knowing, but the expertise wasn't necessarily there. In more modern times, with a wider availability of hadith, they were used in different ways. On the one hand, in polemic ways. So you would just quote a hadith to make your point. Again, that's something we already find in earlier times as well, that people claimed that something they wanted to be believed, that this was actually something that the Prophet said, and therefore give it authority. So other people did the same and came up with other hadith that allegedly went back to the Prophet. Or possibly some even did, but they would just use saying, well, the Prophet said this or that. So that's kind of an polemic approach to that. And in modern times, you also find a more apologetic approach, so that if something is said to criticize Islam in general or specific traits of Islam, hadith is given saying, well, actually, it's not true. See here, the hadith says that the way you interpret Islam is actually wrong. And this is similarly found in Western non-scholarly approaches, where you in debates about Islam, you find people who just quote random hadith, specific hadith, to make a specific point in showing what the Prophet did or did not do, and what he allegedly said. And these are usually taken just out of context because they are widely available. So you can just pick a hadith and say, well, this is what the Prophet said, so this is what Islam is.
And what are some considerations you believe those of us who are non-scholarly should take into account when handling such literature in the absence of experts? Because I feel there are numerous things that are not considered when people like myself and others handle hadith, such as what you mentioned, the context in which it came about, how it's been applied by scholars. So just from your scholarly perspective, what is it that you believe people like myself should consider before and when handling hadith?
I mean, it's difficult if you don't have access to the scholarly debates, neither the Islamic ones by the hadith scholars and legal scholars over the last centuries or millennium. So from a Muslim point of view, it would be useful to see, well, how have they been dealing with this hadith? How was the reliability of these hadith judged, and why? In any case, both from a Muslim and a non-Muslim point of view, I think it's important to bear in mind that the hadith as such doesn't really say a lot if you don't know the context, and to just be careful and not because you see a hadith and you may find it quoted in a reliable source, that this is how Muslims over the centuries have responded to that, and have so it's basically apply some critical thinking as you would do otherwise. If you hear a politician say something, you don't necessarily believe that this is necessarily true. But you say, well, yeah, that's a statement. So where does it come from? What does it rely on? Is that a reliable source? And basically, that's the same that you should apply when you hear a hadith quoted, namely being careful and saying, yeah, well, I need to know more about the context, about how it has been used over the centuries, how it has been judged with regard to the reliability, how it relates to other hadith that may say something very different.
You know, I had created a post not that long ago on Facebook after reading your article, Hadith Between Traditional Scholarship and Academic Approaches. I said, I wish Hadith had gone back. I wish Hadith would go back to being solely the property of the property of specialists. And I actually got a really good reaction from people about that. And I think a lot of people are actually fed up with the way Hadiths are being handled on both sides of the aisle, internal and external, because it really isn't doing justice to not only the traditional Muslim scholarship behind Hadith, but also academic scholarship concerning Hadith as well. It seems like nobody's consulting either one. I mean, you don't have to be a Muslim to consult traditional scholarship on Hadith, and you don't have to be a non-Muslim to consult academic scholarship on Hadith in order to get more context. So,
if I may just say, there is a drawback to that if you say you have to rely on hadith, because it's then basically the traditional scholars, the legal scholars, who define how these hadith should be interpreted. So you're basically taking away the ability of individuals to say, well, maybe this was meant in a different way. And you can see this, for instance, very prominent in feminist scholarship on hadith or on Islam in general. Traditionally, most of the legal scholars were men. And the interpretation was from a very male-dominated perspective of how specific sayings are to be interpreted. And so if you say, well, we have to rely on this interpretation, you have very little room for change and development.
Wow.
So there is a virtue in people being able to read hadith on their own and coming up with different interpretations. But it is important to know that a different interpretation isn't necessarily automatically the correct one. And it may be useful to put it out there, put it out for debate and say, well, why not interpret it in this way?
I think you're definitely right about that. That's something I didn't consider when I had created that Facebook post. I was thinking about more just reining in what I see is starting to become a travesty and mischaracterizing a lot of the literature that's out there. But the point that you have made, I mean, is an extremely important one. You kind of don't want to take that agency from the average person interested in hadith and how they might go about interpreting it based on their own faculties. The problem I have is just that I think that we shouldn't just leave it there with our own interpretation, but also seek out what others have said about the said hadith that is in mention. So the most extreme of non-scholarly approaches you termed polemical. And I like how in your article, Hadith Between Traditional Muslim Scholarship and Academic Approaches, you turn the reader's attention to the fact that it was in a polemically charged sectarian setting in response to the uncritical handling of hadith that traditional Muslim scholarship was born, and from which strictures known as the science of hadith were to develop in order to assess the veracity of each report. Excuse me if I come with long-winded questions. This is my question right here. So Dr. Görke, can you please describe what the setting was like in the period before traditional scholarship took the reins of sifting authentic from inauthentic hadith? And did any kind of methodology exist in the first 2 centuries prior to what traditional scholarship would later come to develop?
That is a very difficult question to answer because our knowledge about the first roughly 2 centuries of Islam is very sketchy because all the written sources are later. And the later sources tend to project back their methodologies and their ideas and their values back onto the earlier generations and assume that what they consider right and what they consider to be a proper methodology was also what earlier generations felt was right. But ultimately, we don't know. So from an historian's point of view, there's very little we can say for sure about that time. We do have some glimpses and ideas of what was going on. And that's because of things that were preserved and that only make sense in a specific setting. So we can say, based on traditional Muslim scholarship, that recorded some forgeries. Not many, mostly forgeries were just sifted out and were no longer transmitted. But scholarship preserved some of these forgeries to demonstrate that they were forgeries, sometimes also because they maybe didn't notice that they were forgeries. And so we can get an idea of some of the forgeries that were made in early Islamic times. So hadith that favored specific persons over others with a very political agenda, or specific dogmatic theological positions over others. And so you can see that there was something going on where people relied on the Prophet, what the Prophet allegedly said, what they made up to bolster their claims. And so what we learn from later tradition is that they apparently asked for confirmation of that, so asked other people whether they heard the same, and tried to think whether something is reasonable or basically what we would do with a statement that we come along if we apply some critical thinking or just human reason. Does that make sense? Is it possible that this is something the Prophet may have said? That's basically the framework. So there were wrongly ascribed hadith were around, and they needed to be reined in, and that's where we can see that the traditional scholarship sets in and said we need to find a way how to sift the authentic from the forged hadith.
And what were the criteria employed by traditional scholarship which enabled them to make clear distinctions between authentic and inauthentic hadith? What did they tend to look for in their assessment, and how successful were they in eliminating or even just simply preventing people from using dubious hadiths?
Yeah, as said, this is something we cannot really say for what happened in the first century and a half.
Well, I mean, after that, when it
Yeah,
started to be more
well,
systematized.
yeah. So when it was more systematically done, so that's from the turn of the 2nd to the 3rd century of Islam, so roughly the beginning of the 9th century, that's where we can find more developed approaches to that. So they were looking primarily for how were hadith transmitted. So were the people who transmitted the hadith back to the Prophet, which by then was some 3 or 4 generations, were they reliable? Were they known to have invented hadith, or did they have a good memory? Were they known for having a memory? Looking at the different people transmitters, did they actually know each other? So if you had different people in this line of transmitters going back to the Prophet, when did they live? Where did they live? Is it possible that they actually met each other? Is it confirmed that people knew that they met each other? So yeah, how reliable were they? How pious were they? That seems to be a point. So were they good Muslims and not of any of the other parties within Islam? So did they conform to your party to be deemed reliable? Otherwise, they might be seen as not as reliable if they didn't have the same political or theological views. And then they look for confirmation in other things. So is that something that other scholars related as well? Are there different lines of transmission telling the same story? And the more lines of transmission you have, the likelier is that this is actually something that is true. And they were also looking to what was transmitted. So is that something that is conceivable? Does it contradict other teachings, other reliable hadith? Does it contradict the Quran? In which case it was seen that, well, if it contradicts the Quran, then it's certainly not something the Prophet would have said. Or does it contradict human reason? Is it something that's inconceivable, something that cannot have happened? Also, to some degree, they found anachronisms. But that seems to have been less of an issue. So we can still find anachronisms. So prophetic hadith relating to cities that weren't yet founded, or to people that weren't yet born, or to movements that didn't exist at the time of the Prophet, and predicting these. And that's, if you conceive of the Prophet as a prophet who might possibly have knowledge of what was to come, then that's something you can't necessarily rule out. From today's view, from an academic point of view, would say, well, this is certainly something that the Prophet will not have said. Here we already see some of the different approaches. Well, and was it successful was part of your question. That is difficult to answer. For traditional Muslim scholarship would probably say mainly yes. So what we now have is mainly what was established as authentic by generations of scholars who have looked through that material again and again, and who came to the conclusion these are actually things the Prophet may have said. Not necessarily verbatim, although in some cases even that. If you look at academic scholarship, the assessment would be very different. And as there are contradictory hadith that are difficult to reconcile, and as there are hadith that contain anachronisms, Western scholarship since at least Goldsier's time, so that's the end of the 19th century, came to the conclusion, well, hadith criticism wasn't successful. It didn't eliminate those. And if we can show that it wasn't completely successful, we can't really know how successful it was. So it didn't catch everything. So how do we know of the rest of what is still there? What of that is authentic and what is not?
And I'm glad you mentioned Goldsher because that makes a great segue into my next comment. It's apparent